By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler appeared to stand at the zenith of his power. To the world, he seemed one of those rare historical figures whose ambitions unfolded with astonishing ease. In 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland without firing a shot. 2 years later, he annexed Austria and a large part of Czechoslovakia. When the inevitable conflict finally erupted in 1939, Germany, under his leadership, crushed Poland in mere weeks. The ensuing period of relative calm, dubbed the Phony War, gave way in the spring of 1940 to the swift collapse of Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. By the summer of 1941, German forces had also secured the Balkans. Virtually all of Europe, from Spain to the Soviet frontier, lay under Hitler's iron grip. Yet how did this seemingly invincible ruler lose everything and end his life by suicide in a Berlin bunker? Let us examine some of the most critical miscalculations that sealed Hitler's fate in the Second World War. At the heart of Hitler's downfall lay his uncompromising and rigid political ideology. As Clausewitz famously observed, war is merely the continuation of politics by other means. But for Hitler, this principle took an extreme form. He viewed the Second World War not only as rightful redress for Germany's defeat in the First World War, but also as the vehicle through which the German people would fulfill their supposed racial destiny, the eradication of both Jews and communism, which he believed to be merely a manifestation of Jewish influence. In an unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly referred to communism as Jewish Bolshevism and described the Soviet Union as Jewish Bolshevik Russia. Given these convictions, it is unsurprising that the Soviet Union had accepted the 1939 non-aggression pact with Stalin only as a temporary expedient to secure victory in the West and avoid a two-front war like the one that had doomed Germany in 1914 to 1918. Yet his ultimate geopolitical aim remained the destruction and conquest of the Soviet Union. To Hitler, the USSR represented not just the epicenter of Jewish Bolshevism, but also vast, fertile territory ideally suited for German colonization once Jews and communists had been eliminated. This was the doctrine of Lebensraum, living space, the belief that ethnic Germans must displace the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe and Russia. As the German population grew, Hitler reasoned, it would require more land, and he intended to seize it by force. The concept of Lebensraum originated in 1901 with the writings of German geographer Friedrich Ratzel. Ratzel argued that every nation must be self-sufficient in resources and territory to defend itself effectively against external threats. Influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection, Ratzel and his followers believed nations were locked in perpetual struggle for survival, and only the fittest would expand and thrive. For ethnic Germans, the lands of Eastern Europe were thus a biological necessity. The idea gained traction during the First World War, when Germany temporarily occupied large swaths of the East and established a military administration known as Ober-Ost. The indigenous peoples under Ober-Ost were treated as a reservoir of land and resources, while German culture was forcibly imposed upon them, a policy termed Kulturmission, cultural mission. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918 granted Germany vast territories far beyond Ober-Ost's original scope. But Germany's defeat later that year shattered these ambitions. Hitler never forgot this experience. He remained convinced that Germany's future Meta-Pause 6 2.0. Thus, rather than consolidating his gains at the height of his power, he deemed it imperative to invade the Soviet Union. For deeply ideological and historical reasons, he believed Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union could not coexist. One had to perish. This conviction led to his greatest strategic blunder, though far from his only one. The manner in which Hitler planned and executed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, proved equally disastrous. He achieved total surprise when, on 22 June 1941, German artillery opened fire on unsuspecting Soviet troops. Yet, the timing itself was a critical error. Originally scheduled for May, the invasion was delayed until late June because Hitler had to intervene in the Balkans after his ally Benito Mussolini suffered humiliating defeats. Although the Balkan campaign succeeded, it cost him a precious month, a delay that would prove decisive. Initially, Barbarossa appeared a stunning success. German forces demonstrated their mastery of mobile warfare, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in massive pockets. For a time, it seemed Hitler's vision of a lightning campaign across the vast Soviet plains might succeed as brilliantly as it had in Western Europe. Yet here, Hitler committed what may have been his most significant operational mistake. Instead of pressing forward toward Moscow, a drive that was advancing rapidly, he ordered the splitting of Army Group Center. He diverted key forces to reinforce Army Groups North and South, which were advancing toward Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Ukraine, respectively. On 21 August, he issued a directive prioritizing the capture of the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, economically vital regions, over the advance on the Soviet capital. His generals vehemently opposed the Meta-Pause, Sex 2.0. Though German troops continued to win battles, these were tactical victories that masked a strategic failure. When Hitler finally resumed the drive on Moscow in early October, he had already lost a crucial month. By early December, German units stood just 12 miles from the city. A reconnaissance patrol even reached within 5 miles. But this marked the high water mark of the German advance. On December 5th, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive that drove the overstretched and undersupplied German forces back 150 miles from the capital and industrial heartland of the USSR. By failing to take Moscow when he had the chance, Hitler ensured he would never do so, and that the Soviet Union would remain in the war. He ruthlessly dismissed any general who dared suggest tactical retreat during this critical phase. Others, fearing dismissal or worse, ceased to challenge his decisions, no matter how irrational. Consequently, Hitler assumed ever greater personal control over the German military, making himself responsible for an expanding array of operational choices. This centralization of command was another fatal error, one whose consequences became starkly evident the following year. Although the German army suffered its first major defeat in late 1941, it was far from exhausted by early one. With his declaration of war against the United States in December 1941, Hitler now faced the very scenario that had destroyed Imperial Germany, a two-front war. Victory over the Soviet Union thus became more urgent than ever. Yet, instead of renewing a full-scale assault on Moscow, Hitler again fixated on the southern front. His new objective was to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Once more, he launched his offensive relatively late in the campaign season, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. He also deemed it essential to capture Stalingrad. Given the city's name, both Hitler and Stalin imbued it with outsized political symbolism. Perhaps as a psychological coping mechanism, Hitler convinced himself that Soviet forces were exhausted, a belief that proved another costly delusion. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army had seized most of Stalingrad. But then, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, aiming to encircle the city. When General Friedrich Paulus requested permission to withdraw and save his army, Hitler refused, insisting the troops must stand and fight for every inch of ground. The result was the encirclement of 300,000 German soldiers. A relief attempt led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein failed. He had only a small strike force of about 50,000 men, and area resupply, promised by Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring, proved impossible. Meanwhile, without Hitler's authorization, Paulus refused to break out and link up with Manstein. In February 1943, the entire Sixth Army surrendered. Stalingrad became the turning point of the war. Germany lost some of its finest soldiers and officers, irreplaceable losses. The Wehrmacht could no longer mount strategic offensives on the Eastern Front, a reality confirmed later that year during the Battle of Kursk, when Operation Citadel collapsed in failure. By invading the Soviet Union out of ideological obsession, Hitler had jeopardized the vast empire he had built. His failure to destroy the USSR when he had the chance guaranteed a slow but inexorable decline from the pinnacle of power. Yet Hitler's errors extended far beyond the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, the United States and Britain had expelled Nazi forces from North Africa and launched an invasion of Europe via Sicily, advancing up the Italian peninsula. This shift in momentum forced Hitler to divert resources westward, ending any hope of winning the war before. By late 1943, it was clear the Allies planned to breach the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, and strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. In Führer Directive No. 51, Hitler explained his reasoning: while the vast expanses of the East allowed Germany to absorb territorial losses without existential risk, the Western Front was different. A successful Allied breakthrough there would bring catastrophic and rapid consequences. All signs pointed to an imminent invasion, no later than spring, possibly sooner. Therefore, further weakening the Western defenses for the sake of other theaters was unacceptable. Reinforcements were ordered, especially in areas deemed critical for launching long-range attacks against Britain, precisely where Hitler believed the decisive battle would unfold. By this stage, despite worsening military realities, Hitler's confidence in his own military genius had only grown. He continued to centralize command, a tendency that inadvertently aided Allied deception efforts. The command structure of German forces in the West was paradoxically fragmented. Not all armored units answered to the theater commander, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Some belonged to Panzer Group West, led by General Leo Geier von Schweppenburg, who, though nominally subordinate to Rundstedt, also reported directly to Hitler. Thus, any deployment of the feared panzer divisions required Hitler's personal approval. The Allies understood that if they could deceive Hitler about the true invasion site, half their battle would be won. The confused command structure on the Western Front only reinforced this strategy. Long before D-Day, Hitler's indecision over panzer deployment, stemming from his insistence on Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with strengthening the Atlantic Wall, argued that armored divisions must be positioned near the beaches to annihilate Allied troops as they landed. Rundstedt disagreed, favoring a more flexible reserve strategy. When Rommel bypassed Rundstedt and appealed directly to Hitler, the Führer, unwilling to choose, attempted to please both. Rommel received 3 panzer divisions, 4 remained under Panzer Group West, and 3 were assigned to Army Group G, south of the Loire, also under Rundstedt's nominal command. As a result, on D-Day, Germany's best mobile forces were disastrously dispersed, with some stationed far from the invasion zone in a sector of negligible strategic importance. This was not Hitler's only blunder during the Normandy campaign. Allied deception operations, most notably Operation Fortitude, exploited the very logic outlined in Hitler's Directive Number 51. Since only a few locations offered viable conditions for a large-scale amphibious landing, the Allies focused their deception on convincing Hitler that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. And Hitler, blinded by ideology and overconfidence, fell for it. The Allies' plan was to convince Hitler that the invasion would target Calais, the closest point across the English Channel. To reinforce this illusion, they created a fictitious formation, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, which was to be commanded by General George S. Patton, widely regarded as one of the Allies' finest field commanders. The most famous element of this deception involved inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and other military equipment visible to German aerial reconnaissance. But this was only the beginning. Carefully orchestrated fake radio transmissions were broadcast, counterfeit documents were prepared, and troops were permitted to troop movements were meticulously choreographed to suggest that Calais was the true objective. To further bolster the ruse, by this time, nearly all Nazi spies in Britain had been captured and turned into double agents under the Double Cross program. The most remarkable of these agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spanish citizen codenamed Garbo. Unlike others, Garcia had originally intended to spy against Nazi Germany. After the British initially rejected his offer, he contacted the Germans, only to later reveal himself voluntarily and become a double agent for British intelligence. Garcia fabricated an entire network of 27 sub-agents, each equipped with highly detailed, plausible backstories. Through scrupulous attention to such details, and others, he and his imaginary network flooded the German high command with intelligence they believed credible, even when it was technically accurate, as it was often rendered useless by timing or context. This modus operandi dated back to 1942, when Garcia provided the Germans with just enough truthful details about Operation Torch landings to establish his credibility. The success of the D-Day landings on June 6th was only the first step toward breaching the Atlantic Wall and liberating Western Europe from Nazi control. Once ashore, the Allies needed to convince Hitler that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion, and that the real invasion was still to come at Calais. It was critical to prevent the Nazis from committing their full strength, especially their panzer divisions, to Normandy. Otherwise, the invasion might be driven back into the sea. On June 5th, Garcia sent his German handlers a warning that an urgent message would follow in the early hours of June 6th. He intended to report detailed intelligence confirming an imminent assault on Calais. But the radio operator This lapse allowed Garcia to relay more accurate information about the Normandy landings than the Allies had originally planned, though, as usual, it arrived too late for the Germans to act effectively. Garcia further cemented his credibility by expressing indignation. "I cannot accept excuses or negligence. Were it not for my ideals, I would abandon this work." Then, on June 9th, he informed the German High Command that the true invasion was still pending at Calais, backing his claim with forged documents that purported to reveal the elaborate structure of the FUSAG-led invasion plan under Patton. For Hitler, who had long believed Calais was the most likely invasion site, these reports were especially persuasive, as they appeared to validate his own military judgment. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was equally deceived. As a result, only a handful of tanks were deployed against the Allies during the critical early phase of Operation Overlord. On 29th July, nearly 2 months after D-Day, Hitler awarded Garcia the Iron Cross for his exceptional service to Germany. Even in August, numerous German forces, including 2 panzer divisions and 19 infantry divisions, remained stationed at Calais, awaiting an invasion that would never come. By then, it was far too late for the Nazis to push the Allies back into the Channel. Hitler's unwarranted self-confidence as a military leader and the chaotic command structure that reflected it cost him the chance to prevent the Allies from breaking through the Atlantic Wall and opening a 2-front war. Ironically, Hitler had been right about one thing. His earlier warning in Führer Directive No. 51 had come true. Yet his last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge in December and January, ended in failure. Less than a year after D-Day, Hitler shot himself in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces, whose invasion he had so confidently dismissed, closed in on his position. This trait may even drive their initial quest for power. Once in control, however, megalomania tends to intensify. In Hitler's case, the combination of an already unstable personality, a grandiose millenarian ideology, and absolute dictatorial authority created the perfect conditions for self-destructive decisions made without informed criticism. Competent subordinates feared speaking up, lest they be dismissed, or worse. Adolf Hitler was far from the only dictator, before or since, to exhibit this pattern of behavior. But he remains the most infamous, not only for the war and genocide he unleashed, but also for the catastrophic strategic blunders he made in waging it. In numerous instances, Hitler could have averted defeat by choosing differently, but time and again he chose wrongly.